The wealthy think about money differently, and Key MBA Models shows you exactly how. Stay until the end. We will focus on what it says about people and work. Stay with me, the best part is near the end. Chapter 1, Part 1, Organizational Behavior. 1. Change Management. Kotter's 8-step model. 2. Cognitive biases in decision-making. 3. Emotional intelligence. 4. Managing work groups. Belbin team roles. 5. Matrix management. 6. Mintzberg S. Managerial roles. 7. Motivation, Theory X and Theory Y. 8. Negotiating techniques. Batna 9. Shine S. Model of organizational culture. 10. 360-degree assessment. Chapter 2, Part 2, Marketing. 11. Customer lifetime value. 12. Ethnographic market research. 13. Market orientation. 14. Multi-channel marketing. 15. Net promoter score. 16. The 4 Ps of marketing. 17. Pricing strategies. Dynamic pricing. 18. Product life cycle. 19. Segmentation and personalized marketing. Chapter 3, Part 3, Strategy and Organization. 20. The ambidextrous organization. 21. The BCG growth share matrix. 22. Blue ocean strategy. 23. Core competence and the resource-based view. 24. Corporate social responsibility, the triple bottom line. 25. Corporate strategy, parenting advantage. 26. 5 forces analysis. 27. Game theory, the prisoner's dilemma. 28. Generic strategies. 29. The McKinsey 7S framework. Chapter 4, Part 4, Innovation and Entrepreneurship. 30. Brainstorming. 31. Design thinking. 32. Disruptive innovation. 33. Grainer's growth model. 34. Open innovation. 35. The 7 domains assessment model for entrepreneurs. 36. Stage/gate model for new product development. 37. Scenario planning. Chapter 5, Part 6, Finance. 44. Black-Scholes options pricing model. 45. Bond valuation. 46. Capital asset pricing model. 47. Capital budgeting. 48. Modern portfolio theory. 49. Modigliani-Miller theorem. 50. Time value of money. 51. Valuing the firm. 52. Weighted average cost of capital. Chapter 6, Part 7, Operations. 53. Agile development. 54. The bullwhip effect. 55. Decision trees. 56. Just-in-time production. 57. Sensitivity analysis. 58. The service profit chain. 59. Six Sigma. 60. Theory of constraints. 61. Total quality management. About the authors. Julian Birkinshaw is Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the London Business School and Director of the Deloitte Centre of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. He is the author of 12 books, including Reinventing Management and Becoming a Better Boss. Ken Mark is CEO of the Martello Group and GM of Steribottle Incorporated. He was finance director at Diversified Resources International and worked for Procter & Gamble and Harvard Business School. He has written case studies for Harvard, Ivy Business School and the London Business School. Acknowledgements. We would like to thank our colleagues at London Business School, Ivy School of Business and other schools for their advice on selecting the management models. In particular, we thank Dr. Colette Southam of Bond University, Australia, for reviewing several sections of the book. We also thank our students, in particular those in the EMBA and MBA programs at London Business School, for providing input into our selection process. Publisher-s acknowledgements. We are grateful to the following for permission to reproduce copyright material. Figure on page 86 adapted from the BCG Portfolio Matrix from the Product Portfolio Matrix, 1970, the Boston Consulting Group, BCG. Figure on page 104 from Strategic Management, Issues and Cases, 2nd ed. John Wiley & Sons, Dobson, P., Starkey, K., and Richards, J. 2009, p. 105, figure on page 109 from How Competitive Forces Shape Strategy, Harvard Business Review, March/April, 2138, Porter, M. Reprinted by permission of Harvard Business Review, figure on page 120 from Structure is Not an Organization, Business Horizons 23, 3, 1426, Waterman, R., Peters, T., and Phillips, J. 1980, reprinted with permission from Elsevier, figure on page 135 adapted from The Innovator's Dilemma, When New Technologies Cause Great Firms to Fail, Harvard Business Review Press, Christensen, C. 1997, p. Reprinted by permission of Harvard Business Review, figure on page 140 from Evolution and Revolution as Organizations Grow, Harvard Business Review 76, 3, 5560, Grainer, L. Reprinted by permission of Harvard Business Review, figure on page 150 from the New Business Road Test, What Entrepreneurs and Executives Should Do Before Launching a Lean Startup, 4th ed., FT Publishing, Mullins, J. 2013, used with permission from John Mullins. Tables table on page 15 from the 9 Belbin team roles, http://www.belbin.com/routeasp ID equals 3, 2012-2014 Belbin Associates, reproduced with permission of Belbin, www.belbin.com, table on page 23 from The Nature of Managerial Work, Pearson Education Incorporated, Upper Saddle River, New Jersey, Mintzberg, H. 1983, p. 92, reprinted and electronically reproduced by permission. Text extract on page 238 from the Agile Manifesto, http://agilemanifesto.org/ used courtesy of the Agile Manifesto. In some instances we have been unable to trace the owners of copyright material, and we would appreciate any information that would enable us to do so. Introduction: There are many models and frameworks in use in the business world today, and it is hard to keep track of them all. We wrote this book to help you make sense of the most important of these models, to understand where they came from, when you might use them, how to use them, and what their biggest benefits and weaknesses are. The title Key MBA Models reflects the fact that these models are all taught to students at business schools seeking to get an MBA, Master's in Business Administration. The MBA is a generalist degree. In other words, it is designed to provide students with a broad grounding in all the key aspects of business. This book reflects the breadth of the MBA. It has 7 sections, each one corresponding to a typical core course in the first year of an MBA program. Each section has between 6 and 10 key models. Think of it as an MBA in a book, a summary of the key models and frameworks that an MBA student learns in his or her core classes. Who should read this book? If you are doing an MBA, this is an easy-to-access summary of the key models you are being taught, with useful pointers about how they should be applied, and follow-up readings if you want to know more. If you are an executive or a manager who didn't go to business school, the book is a valuable reference guide. If your subordinates or colleagues start throwing out unfamiliar terms they picked up at a business school, you want to know what they are talking about. Most of the concepts in the world of business are actually pretty straightforward. This book provides enough details on 60 of the most important ones to get you up to speed. Finally, the book should also be of interest to prospective MBA students who are studying in advance of entering an MBA program, or who are fascinated by the prospect of doing an MBA. If the models and concepts described here look valuable and interesting, then you should take the plunge and sign up for a program. While we have written this as an MBA in a book, It goes without saying that you learn vastly more in the course of an MBA program than could ever be picked up in a single text. What is included? In researching this book, we reviewed the course materials at the business schools we work with, or where we have good friends, such as London Business School, Richard Ivey School of Business, INSEAD, Wharton, and Harvard, and we sought to identify the most important models, frameworks, and concepts that students were taught during their core courses. In most programs, the core courses are followed by a range of elective courses that allow students to specialize. We also market tested our initial selection with a group of students and graduates, by asking them how important they thought each model was. This allowed us to fine-tune our choices. While our selection process was careful, the final list of models is still highly subjective. It is a bit like choosing the most influential people in history, or the best movies of the last 20 years. There is some data you can use to support your choices, but ultimately there is a lot of judgment involved, and we wouldn't expect anyone else to agree 100% with the list we finally settled on. One important criterion we used, for example, was to deliberately include a mix of classic and contemporary models in each section, so you can develop some perspective on the evolution of the subject matter. The book is organized into 7 parts, corresponding to how most business schools structure their core courses, which in turn reflects the academic disciplines that faculty are organized into. Each part includes between 6 and 10 models, arranged in alphabetical order, and at the beginning of each part we have written a brief overview to explain how the models we chose fit together. Of course, there are many important topics in each of these areas that we don't have space to cover. The further reading lists provided at the end of each chapter offer useful pointers for where to get additional information. We will be the first to acknowledge that our chosen structure is a very traditional way of looking at the business world. Some business schools have sought to develop cross-disciplinary or integrative approaches to their teaching, for example by focusing around real-world business challenges. But they are in the minority. The vast majority of business schools still organize their courses as we have done here. To keep the book to a reasonable length, we have had to make some tough choices. We have not included any models that describe the macro business environment, whether in terms of economic theory, government policy, law, or trade regulations. We have steered clear of basic statistical models and tools, and we have spent relatively little time on individual-level psychological issues, or on the challenges of starting a business from scratch. As a general rule, we have focused on issues that are the concern of the firm or business as a whole. Ultimately, these are things that a general manager in a firm needs to know. What is a model? We have used the term model very loosely in this book to include frameworks, concepts, models, and tools. We decided that it was more important to cover the key ideas that MBA students are exposed to in their core courses, than to stick narrowly to a dictionary definition. For example, open innovation is an important concept in the world of innovation and strategy today, so we have a chapter on it, even though it isn't a model as such. Technically speaking, a model is a simplified version of something more complex. It helps you understand a specific phenomenon by identifying its key elements. A framework is a way of structuring your understanding of a multifaceted phenomenon, often by pulling together a number of diverse elements. A concept is a high-level idea, a way of looking at the world that provides new insight. A tool is a practical way of applying a body of thinking to address a particular task. These distinctions are of academic interest only. What matters is that this book includes what we believe to be the most important models, frameworks, concepts, and tools in each area. How you should read the book for most readers. This is primarily a reference book, something to dip into, to remind you what a particular model is for, or to help you understand a concept you hadn't heard before. For others, it might be a way to get up to speed on an entire subject. If you are moving into a marketing role, for example, it would be very useful to read up on the 9 marketing models included here to make sure you understand the lie of the land. There may also be readers who are entering the business world for the first time, in which case reading the whole book from start to finish would make good sense. Julian Birkinshaw and Mark. Chapter 7, Part 1. Organizational behavior. Organizational behavior refers to the ways people interact with each other in the business world. While many elements of the MBA degree are based on financial and statistical analysis, the reality is that this quantitative approach only takes you so far. To get things done inside a company, you need to understand what makes people tick and how to get them to work effectively together. That is what the field of organizational behavior is all about. A useful starting point is to look at the work of managers. What do they actually do on a day-to-day basis? The classic reference here, dating from the 1970s, is Henry Mintzberg's Managerial Roles, a framework that shows how multifaceted and fragmented is the life of a busy executive. While Mintzberg's ideas continue to be important, there was a noticeable shift in business schools during the 1980s and 1990s away from management, which many people thought was too narrow and control-orientated, and towards leadership, which is about mobilizing people to work together to achieve a vision. Many views on leadership have been put forward. In this section, we discuss emotional intelligence as one key characteristic of effective leaders. We also feature 360-degree assessment as a very important way to help individuals become more effective leaders. Another important strand of thinking in the field of organizational behavior is how leaders and managers influence others. Most decision-making processes, for example, are not as rational as we might expect. The chapter on cognitive biases in decision-making discusses why people often make snap judgments that are flawed, and how effective leaders can overcome these types of bias to make better decisions. There is also a chapter on negotiating techniques, with a specific focus on BATNA, which stands for the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. This chapter describes the tactics that you should use to influence others in the specific context of a negotiation. A lot of work in organizations gets done through work groups or teams, and there is a great deal written about the dynamics of effective and ineffective teams. The chapter called Managing Work Groups, Belbin Team Roles describes one well-known model for defining the typical roles that individuals play in teams. At the level of the organization as a whole, leaders use a variety of formal and informal methods to shape the behavior of their employees. On the formal side of the spectrum are the official roles and lines of reporting that determine who is accountable for what. We describe one such structure in detail, matrix management, as a way of highlighting the value and the limitations of this approach. On the informal side of the spectrum, leaders get things done by understanding what makes people tick. One chapter discusses motivation and, in particular, the classic distinction between theory X and theory Y, which continues to be a very useful way of characterizing the underlying drivers of human effort. We also consider how behavior in an organization is shaped more broadly, using Schein's model of organizational culture, and we discuss the tactics leaders use to get people to act differently in the chapter on change management, Kotter's 8-step model. 1. Change management. Kotter's 8-step model. Many executives struggle to implement change in their organizations, and the larger the firm, the bigger the challenge. There are many recipe books for how to implement a change program, and John Kotter's 8-step model is probably the most well-regarded. When to use it to implement a change in your organization, for example, a new formal structure, a new IT system, or a different way of serving your customers. To diagnose why an earlier attempt at making changes has failed, and to come up with a corrective course of action. Origins: the challenge of managing change has existed for as long as organizations have existed. However, it was only when researchers started to understand the behavioral aspects of organizations, and the notion that employees might resist a change they didn't buy into, that our modern view of change management started to emerge. For example, Kurt Lewin, an academic at MIT in the 1940s, showed how it was important to get employees out of their existing way of looking at the world before attempting a major change. Systematic approaches to change management started to emerge in the post-war years, often led by consulting companies such as McKinsey and the Boston Consulting Group, BCG. During the 1980s and 1990s, there were several attempts made to formalize and codify the process. The 8-step model proposed by Harvard professor John Kotter is probably the most well-known. Others include Claes Jansson's 4 Rooms of Change model and Rosabeth Moss-Cantor's Change Wheel. What it is: change management is difficult partly because it appears easy. However, inertia is a very powerful force, and we are all innately suspicious of attempts to disrupt the status quo in our organizations. Executives responsible for setting the strategy of the organization will often see threats and opportunities much more clearly than those in more narrow roles, so a large part of their job in any change is about communicating why change is necessary. John Kotter's 8-step model, therefore, is all about people. It is about how you get employees to adopt a planned change, making the required changes in their work patterns and attitudes. Kotter's model has 8 steps, which should be undertaken in the prescribed order: create urgency, form a powerful coalition, create a vision for change, communicate the vision, remove obstacles, create short-term wins, build on the change, anchor the changes in corporate culture. How to use it: Kotter provides a great deal of detail about how each step of the model should be implemented. Obviously, much depends on the specific circumstances, and a leader should always be prepared to adapt the change plan, depending on the reaction he or she receives. Below is a brief description of how to do each step. Create urgency. This is about convincing employees in the organization that there are problems or opportunities that need addressing. For example, Stephen Alop, the CEO of Nokia in 2012, tried to create urgency for change by talking about the burning platform that Nokia was on and how they needed to be prepared to consider dramatic changes to their business model. Urgency can also be created by starting an honest dialogue with employees about what's happening in the marketplace. Often, customer-facing staff can be your strongest allies in this regard, as they have daily direct feedback about the market. If many people start talking about the need for change, the urgency can build and feed on itself. Form a powerful coalition. While you, as the leader, need to take charge of a major change effort, you cannot do it on your own. So it is important to get key opinion leaders from within the organization to work with you. You can find effective opinion leaders throughout the organization. They don't necessarily follow the traditional company hierarchy. These people need to commit visibly to the change, and then to champion the change within their own part of the organization. Create a vision for change. Often people have very different views of what the future might look like. As leader, you need to create and articulate a clear vision so people can see what it means to them, how it taps into their own interests, and how they might be able to contribute. You don't have to do this alone. Involving key staff at this stage speeds up implementation later on, as they feel more ownership for the change and have a bigger stake in its success. Communicate the vision. In large organizations, it is very difficult to get your message across to everyone, as there are often many layers between you, as a leader, and those operating on the front line. Effective leaders spend a lot of time giving talks, addressing people through multiple media and using their own direct subordinates to help spread the word. Remove obstacles. Even a well-articulated and communicated vision doesn't get everyone on board. There will always be some people resisting, or some structures that get in the way. So you need to work actively to remove obstacles and empower the people you need to execute the vision. Create short-term wins. People have short attention spans, so you need to provide some tangible evidence that things are moving in the right direction early on, typically within a few months. Of course, there is often some game playing here, in that the quick wins were often underway before the change program started. But that rarely detracts from the value they provide in creating momentum. Build on the change. Cotter argues that many change projects fail because victory is declared too early. Quick wins are important, but you need to keep on looking for improvements, so that the organization doesn't slide back into its old ways of working. Anchor the changes in corporate culture. Finally, to make any change stick, it needs to become part of the everyday way of working. This means embedding it in your corporate culture, telling stories about the change process and what made it successful, recognizing key members of the original change coalition and including the change ideals and values when hiring and training new staff. Top practical tip: change management is all about people, and about making relatively small shifts in the way they behave. According to Cotter, your role as a leader is therefore about engaging with employees at an emotional level. They have to be able to see the change, for example, through eye-catching situations where problems are resolved, and to feel it, such as by gaining some sort of emotional response that motivates them to act. This helps to reinforce the desired behaviors. Top pitfall: the Cotter model is very good for top-down change, where the top executives are motivated to change and have a well-informed view of where the organization needs to go. There are some organizations, unfortunately, where these assumptions do not hold, in which case Cotter's model does not work. Such organizations either need a change in leadership, or they need a bottom-up process of change. Further reading: for information on the 4 rooms of change, go to www.claesjansen.com. Cantor, R. 1992, The Challenge of Organizational Change, How Companies Experience It and Leaders Guide It. New York, Free Press. Cotter, J. 1996, Leading Change. Boston, Massachusetts, Harvard Business School Press. 2 Cognitive biases in decision-making. A cognitive bias is a way of interpreting and acting on information that is not strictly rational. For example, you might hire a candidate for a job because they went to the same school as you did. There are many types of cognitive bias with both positive and negative consequences, so it is important to understand how they work. When to use it to understand how you make decisions, so that you can avoid making bad ones. To understand how others reach their point of view in discussions. To influence the decision-making processes in your organization. Origins: while there is a long history of research on cognitive biases, most people agree that the fathers of the field are psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. During the 1960s, they conducted research seeking to understand why people often made flawed decisions. At that point in time, most people believed in rational choice theory, which suggested that humans would make logical and rational deductions based on the evidence available. However, they showed conclusively that this is not so. For example, when faced with the prospect of losing, for example, 1,000, individuals become very risk-averse, whereas the prospect of winning the same amount of money encourages them to become risk-takers. This insight, among many others, helped them to develop an entirely new way of looking at decision-making. Humans don't use algorithms in the way a computer might. Rather, they use heuristics, or rules of thumb, that are simple to compute but introduce systematic errors. Kahneman and Tversky's experiments spawned an entire stream of research that spread beyond psychology into other disciplines, including medicine and political science. More recently, the field of economics embraced their ideas, resulting in the creation of behavioral economics and the awarding of the Nobel Prize in Economics to Kahneman in 2002. What is cognitive bias is a general term used to describe the workings of the human mind that may lead to perceptual distortion, inaccurate judgment, or illogical interpretation. Cognitive biases come in many different forms. Some affect decision-making, for example, the well-known tendency for groups to default into consensus, groupthink, or to fail to see the truth in assembled data, representativeness. Some affect individual judgment, for example, making something appear more likely because of what it is associated with, illusory correlation, while others affect the workings of our memory, for example, by making past attitudes similar to present ones, consistency bias. There are also biases that affect individual motivation, such as the desire for a positive self-image, egocentric bias. The table opposite lists some of the most well-known examples of cognitive biases. How to use it. The main way you use cognitive biases in the workplace is by being aware of their existence, and then taking steps to avoid their damaging side effects. For example, imagine you are in a business meeting and you are being asked to decide whether to go ahead with a proposal to launch a new product. Because of your knowledge of cognitive biases, you ask yourself a number of questions. Is there a reason to think that the people making the recommendation are suffering from bias, for example confirmation bias in their assessment of the potential market size, or are they trying to manipulate the group into a decision based on how they have framed the problem? Was there a high-quality discussion around the table? Did people have an opportunity to voice their concerns? Was the relevant information brought to bear on the discussion? Or did minority voices get drowned out? On the basis of this analysis, it is your job to counter the biases that you think may be creeping in. For example, if you think someone is being selective with the data they are presenting, you can ask an independent expert to provide their own set of data. If you think a meeting has reached agreement too soon, you can call on someone to put forward a counter-argument. One of the most important jobs of the chairman in a meeting, in fact, is to be conscious of these potential biases and to use his or her experience to avoid egregious errors. Name description. Framing. The relative appeal or value of an option or an item fluctuates depending on how it is presented. For example, we expect to pay more for a Coke in a 5* hotel than at a railway station vending machine. Context is key. Confirmation bias. The tendency to search for information in a way that confirms our preconceptions and discredits information that does not support our view. Fundamental attribution error. The tendency for us to overemphasize personality-based explanations for behaviors observed in others. If a driver in front of us swerves unexpectedly, our automatic reaction is to label him a bad driver, whereas in fact he might have swerved to avoid something lying on the road. Availability. The more easily we can recall an event or a group of people, the more common we perceive these events or people to be. Representativeness. When we are asked to judge the probability that an object belongs to a particular category, our estimate is based on how representative that object is of the category, and it ignores the underlying distribution. Anchoring. Establishing the perceived value of something at an arbitrarily high or low level. This is commonly observed in negotiations, for example with a salesperson setting a high price and then discounting it, making us feel as though we have got a better deal. Much the same logic applies to other aspects of work in organizations. When discussing the performance of a subordinate, or when talking to a potential customer, You need always to be alert to the likely cognitive biases they have, and how these might get in the way of a good outcome. There are so many cognitive biases out there that it takes many years of experience to master this process. Top practical tip here is a specific tip for managing a meeting, put forward by Daniel Kahneman. Before a difficult decision has to be made, ask everyone around the table to write down their views on a piece of paper. Then, when it is their turn to speak, they have to say what they wrote on their paper. This avoids people being swayed in their opinions by what the person before them said. Top pitfalls: it is possible to abuse your knowledge of cognitive biases by overanalyzing things. In many business contexts, speed of decision-making is important, so all the techniques described above are helpful, but they can also slow things down a lot. The trick, as always, is about balance, the right blend of careful analytical thinking and intuition-based judgment. The other big pitfall is that it is much easier to recognize cognitive biases in others than in yourself, so don't make the mistake of thinking you are immune from bias. Ask others to guide you on this. Ask them to challenge your thinking, and to tell you if you are falling into one of the traps we have discussed above. Further reading: Kahneman, D. 2012, Thinking, Fast and Slow. London, Penguin Books. Rosenzweig, P. 2007, The Halo Effect. New York, Free Press. Thaler, R., and Sunstein, C. 2008, Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University Press. 3. Emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the ability to monitor your own and other people's emotions. This helps you to discriminate between different emotions and label them appropriately, which in turn helps you to guide your thinking and behavior and increase your personal effectiveness. When to use it to help you do your job as a manager or a leader of others. To decide who to hire or promote. To assess and improve the quality of leadership across an organization. Origins: the concept of emotional intelligence has been around for many decades. Its origins lie with research done by Edward Thorndike in the 1930s, who came up with the notion of social intelligence, or the ability to get along with others. In the 1970s, Howard Gardner, the educational psychologist, showed that there were multiple forms of intelligence, which helped to legitimize the idea that less academically trained forms of intelligence were important. The term emotional intelligence was first used by researcher Wayne Payne in 1985, in his doctoral dissertation. Since then, 3 different approaches to emotional intelligence have emerged. The ability model of Peter Salovey and John Mayer focuses on the individual's ability to process emotional information and use it to navigate the social environment. The trait model of K. Petrites focuses on an individual's self-perceived attributes. It sees emotional intelligence as a set of human traits. The third and most popular approach, put forward by author Daniel Goleman, is a blend of the other two, in that it combines abilities and traits. What it is: there are many different types of human intelligence. Some people are good at mathematics, some are good with words, others have musical skills or good hand-eye coordination. Emotional intelligence is one such type of intelligence. It is very hard to measure, but it turns out to be vitally important in the workplace, and especially for leaders of organizations. One of the hallmarks of great leaders, it is argued, is that they are good at sensing how others are feeling, and adapting their message and their style of interaction accordingly. Great leaders are also very aware of their own strengths and weaknesses, which is another important facet of emotional intelligence. The popular model of emotional intelligence put forward by Daniel Goleman concentrates on 5 components: self-awareness, the ability to recognize and understand personal moods and emotions and drives, and their effect on others. Self-regulation, the ability to control disruptive impulses and moods, suspend judgment and think before acting. Internal motivation, a passion to work for internal reasons that go beyond money and status. Empathy, the ability to understand the emotional makeup of other people. Social skills, proficiency in managing relationships and building networks, finding common ground and building rapport. How to use it. You can use the concept of emotional intelligence in an informal or a formal way. The informal way is to reflect on Goleman's 5 traits as desirable attributes that you or others should have. Do you think you are self-aware? Do you have strong empathy and social skills? This sort of casual analysis can lead to useful insights about things you might do differently, or the type of training course you might want to take. The formal way is to use the official diagnostic surveys created by academics. John Mayer, one of the originators of the concept, says in regard to measuring emotional intelligence, "I am a great believer that ability testing is the only adequate method to employ." There are several different surveys available. EQI is a self-report test designed by Reuven Bar-On to measure competencies including awareness, stress tolerance, problem solving and happiness. The multi-factor emotional intelligence scale gets test takers to perform tasks based on their ability to perceive, identify, and understand emotions. The emotional competence inventory is based on ratings from colleagues on a range of emotion-based competencies. Top practical tip: emotional intelligence is, by nature, very hard to measure. We would all like to think we are emotionally intelligent, but we aren't. So the top practical tip is to get multiple points of view. Sometimes you do this through anonymous feedback and sometimes through group-based coaching sessions, where people give each other candid feedback. Top pitfalls: the problem with a concept such as emotional intelligence is that it sounds so alluring that everyone wants it. However, it takes a lot of time to change your own way of working and how you relate to others. So the biggest pitfall is to think that being assessed and understanding how emotionally intelligent you are is the end point. In fact, this is really just the starting point, because it is then that the hard work of making changes begins. Typically, you cannot do this on your own. You need a helpful boss or colleague, or personal coach. Another pitfall is to misuse emotional intelligence as a way of manipulating others. For example, if you have a really good understanding of how your personal style affects others, you might be able to lure them into doing something they didn't really intend to do. There is a fine line between being skillful and being manipulative, and it is important not to overstep that line. Further reading: Goleman, D. 2006, Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. New York, Random House. Grant, A. 2014, The Dark Side of Emotional Intelligence, The Atlantic, January 2. Petrides, K. and Furnham, A. 2001, Trait Emotional Intelligence, Psychometric Investigation with Reference to Established Trait Taxonomies, European Journal of Personality, 15, 6 425-448. Salovey, P. Mayer, J., and Caruso, D. 2004, Emotional Intelligence, Theory, Findings, and Implications, Psychological Inquiry, 15, 3 197-215. For managing workgroups, Belbin team roles. These days, many people work in teams. Teams can be very productive, because they allow people with different skills to work together in creative ways, but they can also be highly dysfunctional. Figuring out what makes teams effective is therefore important, and a key part of this is to understand the different roles individuals play in teams. The Belbin Team Inventory is a well-known personality test that measures your preference towards 9 different roles you can play in a team. When to use it to build productive working relationships in teams. To improve your own self-awareness, in terms of the roles you typically play in a team context. To build and develop high-performing teams. Origins researchers have studied the dynamics of teams for many years. One of the most famous studies was conducted in the early 1970s at Henley Business School, outside London. Under the leadership of Dr. Meredith Belbin, researchers studied the dynamics of competing teams during an executive training program. They recorded the types of contributions made by participants during the team meetings, and they also examined how effective the teams were in their activities. The researchers had expected to see the high-intellect teams performing better, based on the team members' performance in various IQ tests. However, it turned out that the highest-performing teams were actually those where team members performed a balanced mix of roles. Some teams, for example, had too many people who wanted to take the lead, while others had too few. This analysis led Belbin and his team to identify 9 different team roles that individuals typically play in teams, and they argued that the most successful teams are those in which all 9 roles are, to varying degrees, filled. Many subsequent studies have built on Belbin's analysis and indeed challenged some aspects of his findings. But the basic notion, that people need to fulfill different roles in order for the teams to function effectively, has been strongly endorsed. Many firms have subsequently used Belbin's analysis as a way of understanding both individual and team behavior. What it is in a team environment, people tend to take on certain roles that are a function of their own personal strengths and also their relationship with the others in that team. A team role is defined as a tendency to behave, contribute and interrelate with others in a particular way. Belbin identified 9 such roles, categorized into 3 groups: action-orientated, people-orientated, and thought-orientated. They are summarized in the table below. Team role contribution: allowable weaknesses, plant creative, imaginative, free-thinking. Generates ideas and solves difficult problems. Ignores incidentals. Too preoccupied to communicate effectively. Resource investigator: outgoing, enthusiastic, communicative. Explores opportunities and develops contacts. Overoptimistic. Loses interest once initial enthusiasm has passed. Coordinator: mature, confident, identifies talent. Clarifies goals. Delegates effectively. Can be seen as manipulative. Offloads own share of the work. Shaper: challenging, dynamic, thrives on pressure. Has the drive and courage to overcome obstacles. Prone to provocation. Offends people's feelings. Monitor evaluator: sober, strategic and discerning. Sees all options and judges accurately. Lacks drive and ability to inspire others. Can be overly critical. Teamworker: cooperative, perceptive and diplomatic. Listens and averts friction. Indecisive in crunch situations. Avoids confrontation. Implementer: practical, reliable, efficient. Turns ideas into actions and organizes work that needs to be done. Somewhat inflexible. Slow to respond to new possibilities. Completer: finisher, painstaking, conscientious, anxious. Searches out errors. Polishes and perfects. Inclined to worry unduly. Reluctant to delegate. Specialist: single-minded, self-starting, dedicated. Provides knowledge and skills in rare supply. Contributes only on a narrow front. Dwells on technicalities. Source: The 9 Belbin Team Roles, www.belbin.com/routeasp. ID equals 3. Reproduced with permission. For each role there is a typical set of contributions that an individual makes to a team, and also a characteristic weakness that goes with that role. Belbin calls these weaknesses allowable on the basis that they don't necessarily get in the way of the team achieving its objectives, as long as people understand and compensate for them. How to use it? The Belbin Team Roles model can be used in several ways. At an individual level, you can use it as a way of understanding your own preferred way of working, and perhaps to develop your strengths in areas where you are relatively weak. This sort of self-awareness can be very valuable in a team situation, as it reduces the risk of getting annoyed with others who see their role in the team differently to how you see yours. At a team level, the Belbin inventory can be a useful way of assessing the balance between team members before a project starts, or perhaps just after it has got underway. This can alleviate some of the difficult dynamics between team members. For example, a team with too many shapers and coordinators will often see sparks fly, because these individuals all want to be in charge. A team with too many completer finishers and specialists, on the other hand, might struggle to get moving initially, or might lack creativity. At an organizational level, you can also use the Belbin inventory as a way of selecting which people to put into teams. Of course, there is no perfect combination of roles, as many people are sufficiently skilled to consciously play different roles depending on the circumstances, but at a minimum it is a good idea to make sure there are some people with expertise in each of the action, interpersonal and thought categories. Top practical tip: people gravitate to certain team roles on the basis of their areas of expertise and also their day-to-day work. So consultants will often move, by default, into the role of a shaper or completer finisher, whereas people working in an R&D lab may take on the role of a specialist or plant. This is important to keep in mind, because teams can quickly become unbalanced if they have too many people playing a particular role. If you find yourself overseeing a team of consultants, for example, you should be careful to avoid the too many chiefs, not enough Indians scenario. Be prepared to make some deliberate changes to the makeup of the team by drafting in people who fill any notable gaps in the team profile, or by reassigning certain people to other teams. Top pitfalls: Belbin's team roles are based on observed behavior and interpersonal styles, but there is no suggestion that people have predefined ways of working. In fact, many people are highly flexible, and your own interpersonal style is likely to depend to a large degree on the situation in which you find yourself. In one team you might find yourself as a coordinator, in the next you could take on the role of specialist or plant. The biggest pitfall, in other words, is to assume that your preferred way of working, as predicted by the Belbin team role inventory, is your only way of working. It is useful to know your preference, but it is much better to be adaptable. It is also useful to know that there are many other guides to team behavior, and indeed some of them have stronger academic underpinnings than Belbin's model. The advantage of Belbin's work is that it is widely known and makes intuitive sense, but you should always be open to alternative ways of managing team dynamics. Further reading: Belbin, R. 1996, Team Roles at Work. Oxford, UK, Butterworth Heinemann. Katzenbach, J., and Smith, D. 2005, The Wisdom of Teams Creating the High-Performance Organization. New York, McGraw-Hill Professional. 5 Matrix Management. A matrix is an organizational structure through which people report to 2 or more bosses. For example, the manager at Unilever responsible for ice cream sales in France might report to the head of the ice cream business in London and also to the country manager responsible for all of Unilever's business in France. Most large firms use some sort of matrix, often with more than two dimensions. Matrix management creates many challenges for those operating in it. When to use it to structure your organization so that you can operate effectively in a complex world. To help managers understand their sometimes conflicting responsibilities. To adapt your organization to new challenges. Origins. The first known matrix structure was put in place by aircraft manufacturer McDonnell in the early 1950s, as a way of reconciling the demands for efficient delivery of specific projects, such as an aircraft order from the U.S. government, while also achieving high levels of functional specialization for each different activity. In this structure, teams of employees essentially worked for two bosses, one project boss and one functional boss. Other forms of matrix structure soon followed. International firms, such as IBM, Dow Chemical, and Digital Equipment, created global matrix structures during the 1970s with reporting lines to strategic business unit heads on one side and country heads on the other. Professional services firms, such as Citibank and McKinsey, developed matrix structures with their service lines on one side and their city or country-based resource pools on the other. But matrix structures are not easy to implement because they tend to slow decision-making down, and during the 1980s a lot of firms moved away from them and back towards simpler structures with a single primary line of reporting. Interestingly, though, the matrix came back into favor again in the 1990s, partly because of the necessities of managing multiple objectives, and partly thanks to high-profile firms, such as the Swiss/Swedish engineering firm ABB, advocating this structure. While many observers continue to criticize the matrix structure, it is a necessary evil for large firms operating in complex business environments. When it is a matrix structure indicates formal relationships, the boxes and lines on an organization chart. The concept of matrix management refers to the entire way of working that goes around the matrix structure, which includes the various systems for monitoring and evaluating performance, for sharing information and for allocating resources, as well as the informal way that people behave within such a structure. Almost all large firms operate in a complex business setting where they face demands that pull them in more than one direction. For example, consider an international firm operating in the food industry. One set of demands pulls it towards global integration, which means organizing its factories and development activities around its major product areas. Another set of demands pulls it towards local responsiveness, which means thinking about the needs of customers on a country-by-country basis. Faced with these conflicting demands, the firm can choose to focus primarily on one of them, which allows it to create a simple hierarchical structure where everyone has a single boss. Alternatively, the firm can choose to focus on both at the same time, which is achieved by creating a matrix structure that helps the firm to address its conflicting demands in equal measure. However, it can also slow decision-making down, because if a manager's two bosses have contrary views, then they need to resolve their differences before the manager can take action. Some firms use a balanced matrix structure, where both the manager's bosses have equal power and responsibility. However, this approach tends to result in large numbers of meetings to resolve disagreements. Most firms have therefore moved to an unbalanced form of matrix, where a manager has a solid line reporting relationship to one boss and a dotted line relationship with one or more other bosses. The dotted line bosses have no formal authority over the manager in question. Instead, they typically provide guidance and information, and they help to coordinate activities. Some firms use this unbalanced form of matrix to coordinate activities on 4 or 5 different dimensions. For example, a manager at IBM might have a solid line reporting relationship with a business unit head, such as consulting, then dotted line relationships with a country head, USA, a functional head, sales, and also someone responsible for a vertical client sector, pharmaceuticals. How to use it. Matrix management has a number of well-established advantages and disadvantages. The advantages include delivering work across the firm in an effective way, overcoming organizational silos, responding flexibly to external demands, developing the skills of managers. The disadvantages include having multiple bosses, which can be confusing and lead to frustration, managers becoming overburdened, senior managers spending enormous amounts of time in internal meetings, decision-making becoming very slow. To overcome these disadvantages, firms have to give a lot of attention to the formal and informal structures that support the matrix. As noted above, one useful approach is to make the matrix deliberately unbalanced, so that it is clear where the primary line of reporting lies. This means that in cases where the two bosses disagree, one of them has the right to overrule the idea, and this helps to speed up decision-making. Another part of making matrix management work is to ensure that the supporting systems are helpful. For example, a well-designed IT system that provides frequent updates to everyone on, for example, production volumes or sales numbers, ensures that decisions are made on the basis of high-quality information. Equally, incentive systems are often created to reward senior managers on the performance of the whole business, rather than one part. In both cases, this reduces the risk of managers making decisions to support their parochial, or pet, interests. The third part of making matrix management work is to give attention to the informal culture of the firm. It is often said that you should seek to create a matrix in the mind of the manager so that, regardless of the formal structure, every manager tries to act in the overall interests of the firm, rather than the narrow perspective of their business unit or function. There are many ways to work on improving this informal culture, for example by creating training programs and events where managers in different areas get to know each other better, or by transferring managers from one job to another, so that they get a taste for how the whole firm works. Top practical tip: if you work in a matrix structure, the first thing to do is to make sure you understand how it works. Is it a balanced matrix with two equal bosses? Or is it an unbalanced matrix in which one line of reporting dominates? Armed with this information, you are then in a better position to make the right judgments about what work to prioritize, or from whom to seek permission when pursuing a new project. If you are in doubt, follow the money. The more budget one dimension of the matrix has, the more powerful it is. Top pitfall: every organizational structure has its weaknesses, and over time those weaknesses tend to compound. A matrix structure that is balanced will, over time, become extremely slow-moving and bureaucratic. A matrix that is unbalanced will tend to give too much power to certain people at the expense of others, which will not be good for the firm as a whole. So the biggest pitfall is allowing the existing structure to endure for a very long period of time. Further reading: Bartlett, C., and Ghoshal, S., 1990, Matrix Management, Not a Structure, A Frame of Mind, Harvard Business Review, July-August, 138-45. Davis, S., and Lawrence, P., 1977, Matrix. Boston, Massachusetts, Addison Wesley. Galbraith, J., 2013, Designing Organizations, Strategy, Structure, and Process at the Business Unit and Enterprise Levels. Hoboken, New Jersey, John Wiley & Sons. 6 Mintzberg guess managerial roles. What do managers actually do in the workplace? Henry Mintzberg showed that managers do 3 types of things: informational work that involves sharing and disseminating information to those around them, interpersonal work that involves working with individuals to get the most out of them, and decisional work that involves doing deals and making tough choices. By understanding the nature of these different roles, we can all become more effective as managers. When to use it to understand and critique your own style of managing. To evaluate the overall effectiveness of your organization. To design a training or development program for managers. Origins. Henry Mintzberg wrote his PhD thesis at the MIT Sloan School of Management, with a study focusing on the day-to-day work habits of chief executive officers, CEOs. Up to this point, people had tended to focus on the functions of management, such as planning, organizing, controlling and budgeting. By following executives around, and monitoring how they actually spent their time, Mintzberg was able to put forward a completely different perspective on the nature of managerial work. His ideas gained popularity very quickly, and spawned a whole field of further research on the topic. Over the years, many people have shifted their focus towards leadership, that is, the way an executive inspires others to follow him or her. But understanding management, the art of getting work done through others, is still vitally important, and Mintzberg's original research on managerial roles is where it all started. What it is in writing up his research on CEOs, Mintzberg made some important observations about how they spend their time in the workplace. Managers work at an unrelenting pace, and they are strongly orientated to action. They strongly favor verbal media, telephone calls, and meetings over documents. They spend most time with their subordinates and external parties, and relatively little with their superiors. Their activities are relatively short in duration, an average of 9 minutes, and are highly varied and fragmented. Based on these observations, Mintzberg identified 10 distinct roles that executives perform during their day-to-day working lives, as shown in the table below. Category role activity examples: informational monitor, seek and acquire work-related information. Scan/read trade press, periodicals, reports, attend seminars and training, maintain personal contacts. Disseminator communicate/disseminate information to others within the organization. Send memos and reports, inform staffers and subordinates of decisions. Spokesperson communicate/transmit information to outsiders. Pass on memos, reports and informational materials, participate in conferences/meetings and report progress. Interpersonal figurehead performs social and legal duties, act as symbolic leader. Greet visitors, sign legal documents, attend ribbon-cutting ceremonies, host receptions, etc. Leader direct and motivate subordinates, select and train employees. Includes almost all interactions with subordinates. Liaison establish and maintain contacts within and outside the organization. Business correspondence, participation in meetings with representatives of other divisions or organizations. Decisional entrepreneur, identify new ideas and initiate improvement projects. Implement innovations, plan for the future. Disturbance handler, deal with disputes or problems and take corrective action. Settle conflicts between subordinates, choose strategic alternatives, overcome crisis situations. Resource allocator, decide where to apply resources. Draft and approve of plans, schedules, budgets, set priorities. Negotiator, defend business interests. Participate in and direct negotiations within team, department and organization. Source: Mintzberg, H. 1983, The Nature of Managerial Work. Upper Saddle River, New Jersey, Pearson Education Incorporated. reproduced with permission. In summary, Mintzberg's research exposed many of the myths of the time about what managers really do. For example, he challenged the idea that CEOs think through problems in advance, or with deep foresight. Many of them are, in fact, highly reactive and opportunists in the way they work, and they are comfortable being constantly interrupted. Mintzberg's work was also influential in what became known as the situational view of leadership. In other words, rather than arguing that some executives have stronger leadership and management capabilities than others, he argued that capabilities are context-specific. The most effective leaders are those who can tailor their behavior to what is required in the circumstances. How to use it if you are a manager. Mintzberg's roles provide a useful way of helping you to think through your responsibilities. Take each of the 10 roles in turn, and ask yourself 2 questions. How much time do I actually spend doing this? And how much time should I spend doing this in an ideal world? This simple analysis helps you to figure out what sorts of things to prioritize, and what sorts of activities you should be downplaying or getting out of altogether. If you are trying to make an entire organization work more effectively, you can use Mintzberg's roles to design some sort of management development program. Where are the biggest weaknesses in the skill sets of the company's managers? What sort of training do they need? For example, many companies find that their managers aren't sufficiently skilled in leading others, or that they lack skills in negotiating, and this is very helpful in defining the appropriate training program for them. Remember that these different roles are complementary, they build on each other, and together they make up a rounded whole. According to Mintzberg, the manager who only communicates or only conceives never gets anything done, while the manager who only does ends up doing it all alone. Top practical tip: at a practical level, most managers spend far too much time on task-oriented roles, such as working on emails or attending meetings, and not enough on interpersonal roles such as coaching and developing their subordinates. So if you want to become more effective as a manager, keep a timesheet and note down how much time you spend on each activity over the course of a week. By showing how you are actually spending your time, you create the impetus to change your behavior, and to invest more time in the work that really matters. Top pitfall: Mintzberg's original analysis was descriptive, which means he simply documented what he observed, rather than claiming that there was some sort of ideal mix of roles that managers should undertake. So the biggest pitfall here is to think that every manager needs to do all these things. Instead, the 10 roles should be used as a diagnostic tool, and you should understand that, depending on the job, some roles will be far more important than others. Further reading: Mintzberg, H. 1983, The Nature of Managerial Work. Upper Saddle River, New Jersey, Pearson Education Incorporated. Mintzberg, H. 2012, Managing. Oakland, California, Barrett Kohler. Tenglad, S. 2006, Is There a New Managerial Work? A comparison with Henry Mintzberg's classic study 30 years later, Journal of Management Studies, 43, 7 1437 1461. 7. Motivation, Theory X and Theory Y. Theory X and Theory Y represent differing perspectives on human motivation. Theory X says that people are basically lazy, they don't want to work. To ensure that they do a good job, you have to pay them, and you have to link their pay directly to what they produce. Theory Y says that people like to work, they want to do a good job and develop themselves. Paying them well is less important than providing them with a stimulating working environment. When to use it: to understand what makes people tick and how to manage them better. To design jobs that get the best out of people. To develop an effective compensation or incentive system. Origins: Douglas McGregor was a social psychologist working at MIT in the 1950s, alongside other leading management theorists such as Ed Schein and Kurt Lewin. He put forward his ideas in his classic book, The Human Side of Enterprise. He was dismayed at the extent to which many companies treated their employees as cogs in a machine, and he thought that an alternative view, based around tapping into people's innate desire to do a good job, needed to be developed. Theory X was, in essence, the bad old way of working that had been labeled as scientific management in the 1920s. Theory Y was the alternative, more humanistic approach that McGregor put forward. His work built on the earlier ideas of Abraham Maslow, who had put forward the idea that people have a hierarchy of needs from basic physiological needs and safety through to love, esteem, and self-actualization. What it is: there are two basic views of human nature in the workplace. Theory X assumes that employees are naturally unmotivated and dislike working, which means managers need to provide a lot of oversight to ensure that employees get their work done. This means, for example, careful supervision and also a heavy reliance on incentives, financial rewards for completing work, penalties for those who shirk or make errors. In contrast, Theory Y assumes that employees are intrinsically motivated to work, and will naturally do a good job if given the right opportunities. According to this worldview, managers have a very limited role. Their job is to define what has to be done to provide support where necessary, and then just to get out of the way. Responsibility, in a Theory Y world, lies primarily with those doing the work, whereas in a Theory X world, the responsibility stays with the managers overseeing the work. Which theory is right? Well, they are both partially correct. The reality is that people vary enormously in terms of what motivates them, ranging from mostly money, Theory X, on one end of the spectrum through to the joy of work, Theory Y, on the other end. By understanding where employees sit on this spectrum, companies can develop management styles and incentive systems to match those different drivers. For example, there are many factories, call centers, and fast food operations that operate on a Theory X model, while many professional services companies, R&D operations, and startups use a Theory Y model. Theory X/Theory Y is the most famous model in the field of human motivation, but thinking in this area has continued to evolve. A recent extension is self-determination theory. See further reading. How to use it. Theory X/Theory Y is a way of looking at the world, rather than an immediately practical tool. So there are many different ways of applying it. At an individual level, you can use it to diagnose what makes a person tick, what sort of factors lead them to put in long hours. Some people subscribe to Theory X, and are motivated primarily by making money. Some subscribe to Theory Y and are motivated by being given interesting work to do. Others lie somewhere in between, and are motivated by the opportunity to work with interesting colleagues, or to gain the respect of those around them. If you are able to identify the relative importance of these different drivers for people in your team, you will know which of their buttons to press, and you will end up doing a much better job of managing them. Note, however, that what makes a person tick isn't completely innate. It is also partly driven by the context in which they are working. At an organizational level, Theory X/Theory Y underlies a lot of the basic choices a company makes about how work gets done. For example, do you use a strict command and control style of working, Theory X, or do you empower your people and encourage them to participate in decision-making, Theory Y? Does your incentive system reward individuals for their specific outputs, Theory X, or is it based on the entire team or organization doing well, Theory Y? A key point here is that the theory you choose has self-reinforcing qualities. For example, If you design the organization using Theory X principles, then you will force people to work in a narrow, target-driven way. There is no clear right or wrong here. Rather, you need to start with a point of view of what the right theory is for your organization, and then you have to build the structure and incentive system in a way that is consistent with that theory. Top practical tip: while it is tempting to see Theory X and Theory Y as opposing views, the reality is that they are both partially true. We are all motivated to some degree by money, just as we are all motivated to some degree by doing a good job for its own sake. Given that Theory Y is an inherently more productive and inspiring worldview, it therefore makes sense to try to make it work. For example, if you manage a team of employees, try to give them space to make their own choices and to take responsibility for their actions. Look for ways of supporting and encouraging them, rather than just telling them what to do. Try to reward them for effort, or on a collective basis, rather than just on narrow measures of outputs. It is challenging to do these things, but it can also be very rewarding. And remember, you can always fall back on Theory X if this approach doesn't work. Top pitfall: whichever theory you subscribe to in your company, you run the risk of creating undesirable side effects. If you work in an organization that subscribes to a Theory X style of management, you run the risk of creating a hostile and distrustful atmosphere. Many unionized operations have fallen into this trap, and it makes for unhappy feelings among workers and managers alike. If you work in an organization that subscribes to a Theory Y style of management, the atmosphere is likely to be much more positive, but with the risk of a lack of control and coherence. Some employees may take advantage of you as a Theory Y manager, for example by spending excessive amounts of money on travel, or taking long lunch breaks. Further reading: Deci, E., and Ryan, R., 2002, Handbook of Self-Determination Research. Rochester, New York, University of Rochester Press. McGregor, D., 1960, The Human Side of Enterprise. New York, McGraw-Hill. Maslow, A., 1954, Motivation and Personality. New York, Harper. Pink, D., 2011, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. New York, Riverhead Books. 8 Negotiating Techniques. BATNA stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. Whenever you negotiate with another party, there is a chance that the negotiation may break down and that you will have to fall back on some alternative course of action. Your BATNA is this alternative course of action. Being clear on what it is, and what is the other party's BATNA, is crucial to effective negotiation. When to use it to get a better deal for yourself whenever you negotiate anything, for example a pay rise or buying a house. To help your firm handle complex negotiations, for example acquiring another firm or resolving a dispute with a labor union. Origins: people have been negotiating with one another since civilization began, and over the years a lot of academic research has been done to establish the factors that contribute to a successful negotiated outcome in a business setting. The term BATNA was coined by researchers Roger Fisher and William Ury in their 1981 book Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In. While the notion of understanding your fallback position in a negotiation was in existence before, the BATNA label proved very powerful as a way of focusing attention on the key elements of a negotiation. It is now a very widely used term. What it is to negotiate effectively, you need to understand your BATNA. This is your walkaway option, the course of action you will take if the negotiation breaks down and you cannot agree with the other party. Sometimes it is really clear what the BATNA is, however, it is not necessarily obvious. Let us say you have developed a new consumer product, but you are struggling to agree a reasonable price with a major supermarket chain. Is your best alternative here to sell it through a smaller chain of supermarkets? To sell it online? Or to drop the product launch altogether? There are many other factors at play here, and these include non-quantifiable things such as your personal reputation. How to use it? According to Fisher and Urey, there is a simple process for determining your BATNA that can be applied to any negotiation. Develop a list of actions you might conceivably take if no agreement is reached. Improve some of the more promising ideas and convert them into practical options. Select, provisionally, the one option that seems best. Note that a BATNA is not the same thing as a bottom line that negotiators will sometimes have in mind as a way of guarding themselves against reaching agreements where they give too much. A bottom line is meant to act as a final barrier, but it also runs the risk of pushing you towards a particular course of action. By using the concept of a BATNA, in contrast, you think less about the objectives of a specific negotiation and instead you focus on the broader options you have to achieve your desired objectives. This provides you with greater flexibility and allows far more room for innovation than a predetermined bottom line. Negotiation dynamics. If you are clear what your own BATNA is, you know when to walk away from a negotiation. It is also important to think about the BATNA of the other party. For example, if you are trying to negotiate terms for a new job with an employer, and you know there are other good people shortlisted for that job, then the employer's BATNA is simply to hire the next person on the list. The catch here is that you often do not know what the other party's BATNA really is, and indeed it is often in their interests to keep this as hidden as possible. One useful variant of BATNA is the notion of an EATNA, an estimated alternative to a negotiated agreement, which applies in the frequent cases where one or both parties are not entirely clear what their best alternative looks like. For example, in any courtroom battle, both sides are likely to believe they can prevail, otherwise they wouldn't be there. Should you reveal your BATNA to the other party? If it is strong, there are benefits to disclosing it as it forces the other party to confront the reality of the negotiation. If your BATNA is weak, it is generally best not to disclose it. Sometimes it is possible to bluff your way to a better outcome than you would otherwise achieve. Top practical tip: the key idea of thinking through your BATNA is that it doesn't lock you into one course of action. People often enter a negotiation with predetermined positions, such as a particular price, underpinned by certain interests, fears, hopes, expectations, and this often means that the negotiation breaks down, with both sides losing out. Your challenge as a negotiator is to look beyond the positions initially communicated and to uncover and explore the interests that gave rise to these positions. This often involves some creativity and some openness on both sides to broaden the dimensions on which they believe they are negotiating. Top pitfalls: while it is useful to think through the dynamics of a negotiation and to try to anticipate the other party's BATNA, the biggest pitfall is not knowing your own BATNA. For example, in a corporate situation, you will often find yourself exposed to internal pressure from colleagues to make an agreement happen, which may mean committing to terms that are unfavorable. By being explicit on your BATNA in advance, and communicating this to colleagues, you can avoid finding yourself in an awkward position. A related pitfall is to be overconfident that you know the BATNA of the other party. If an employee comes to you asking for a raise because he has an offer from a competing firm, do you really know how serious he is about taking that offer? Obviously, you will have some intuitive sense of his preferences, and this will guide your negotiation, but if you tell yourself he is not serious about leaving, you run the risk of lowballing your offer to him and losing a good person. Further reading: Burgess, H., and Burgess, G., 1997, The Encyclopedia of Conflict Resolution. Santa Barbara, California, ABCCLIO. Fisher, R., and Urey, W., 1981, Getting to Yes, Negotiating Agreement Without Giving In. London, Random House. 9 Shyness Model of Organizational Culture. Every organization has a culture, an unwritten set of norms and expectations about how people should behave. Cultures are hard to define and very hard to change, but they matter a lot because they shape behavior and they influence who chooses to join and leave. Many attempts have been made to make sense of culture over the years. Ed Schein, a professor at MIT, has put forward one of the most influential models. When to use it to diagnose the culture where you work. To understand what sorts of behavior are acceptable, and why. To help you make changes. Origins. There is a long history of thinking about organizational culture, sometimes using the related concept of organization climate. Ed Schein was a professor at MIT during the 1970s who worked alongside other famous behavioral researchers such as Kurt Lewin and Douglas McGregor. His studies focused on how individuals and organizations made sense of their own roles and motivations, and how organizations enabled or frustrated individuals in pursuit of their objectives. His 1985 book, Organizational Culture and Leadership, provided a defining statement of what culture is and how it can be influenced by the leaders of the organization. Many subsequent studies have built on his work, often with the intention of defining particular types of culture. Important examples are Daniel Dennison's Corporate Culture and Organizational Effectiveness and Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones' The Character of the Corporation. What it is. According to Schein, culture is a subjective interpretation, a set of assumptions, that people make about the group or organization in which they work. It operates at 3 levels: artifacts, what you experience with your senses; espoused beliefs and values, basic underlying beliefs. Artifacts are all tangible, overt, or verbally identifiable elements in an organization. For example, if you go to Google's campus, you see people wearing casual clothing and the buildings are quite funky, with unusual furniture, leisure equipment, games rooms, and so on. You don't even have to speak to anyone to pick up on some aspects of Google's culture. Espoused beliefs and values are what people in the organization say their norms of behavior are. It is how employees represent the organization both to themselves and to others. Sometimes it's done through written vision and values statements, sometimes it is through the more informal ways that people talk. Shared basic assumptions are the taken for granted aspects of how individuals behave in an organizational context. These are usually subconscious, and so well integrated into the patterns of behavior in a workplace that they aren't even acknowledged. At Google, for example, it is assumed that if you hire the cleverest people and give them lots of freedom, then they will come up with groundbreaking innovations. These 3 layers can be understood through the iceberg metaphor. Artifacts and espoused beliefs are visible, but the shared basic assumptions are under the surface and are actually the most important part. How to use it. Schein's model is primarily descriptive. In other words, it is designed to help you diagnose the culture of the organization you work for, or are offering advice to. So rather than just focus on the visible artifacts, Schein's work encourages you to get at the underlying beliefs and our assumptions, so that you understand what is really going on. In his 1985 book, Schein recommends the following steps in deciphering and assessing cultures: visit and observe, identify artifacts and processes that puzzle you, ask insiders why things are done that way, identify espoused values and ask how they are implemented, look for inconsistencies and ask about them, figure out from the above the deeper assumptions that determine the observed behavior. One caveat to this approach is that culture has a subjective quality. In other words, Any conclusions you reach about the deeper assumptions that make the organization tick may not be things others agree with. Top practical tip: MBA model is valuable because it forces people to get to grips with the unwritten assumptions about behavior in their organizations. Rather than focus on the visible artifacts, you should therefore always ask why the organization works the way it does, and seek to get at some of these underlying assumptions. Top pitfall: make sure not to confuse organizational beliefs and values with individual beliefs and values. Psychologists will tell you that our beliefs and values as individuals are set at a very young age, certainly before we are adults, and that they are almost impossible to change. So when we talk about organizations having certain values, we are not saying that all the individuals in the organization fully conform to those values. Hopefully, individuals will, for the most part, choose to work for organizations whose values mirror their own, but this will not always be the case. One consequence of this point is that when we talk about culture change in organizations, we are typically seeking to change the way people behave in the first instance, and to encourage some of their underlying values to become more salient. We are not asking them to change their underlying values. That is more or less impossible. Further reading: Dennison, D. 1990, Corporate Culture and Organizational Effectiveness. Hoboken, New Jersey, John Wiley & Sons. Goffey, R., and Jones, G., 2003, The Character of the Corporation. London, Profile Books. Shine, E., 1985, Organizational Culture and Leadership. San Francisco, California, Josse Base. 10 360-degree assessment. 360-degree feedback is a management tool that gives employees the opportunity to receive feedback from multiple sources. It is also known as a 360-degree review. It is called 360-degree feedback because the feedback comes from all around: subordinates, peers, supervisors, customers, etc. When to use it: to give you feedback on your performance and your management style from those around you to help you create an effective personal development plan. To help the firm assess your performance, and to make pay and promotion decisions. To monitor the standard of leadership or the culture of the organization as a whole. Origins: the I. That is the heart of key MBA models. If it helped, a quick subscribe keeps more summaries coming. So how do people and work connect? That is exactly where we started. Go back to the top and watch it click into place.